With all its imperfections, it was excusable in the beginnings of philosophy, and is not a great deal more remote from the truth than many others which have since been substituted in its room by some of the greatest pretenders to accuracy and precision. Mankind have had, at all times, a strong propensity to realize their own abstractions, of which we shall immediately see an example, presumably the discussion in paragraph 7 below of Aristotle's doctrine of potential existence. In the notions of that very philosopher who first exposed the ill-grounded foundation of those ideas or universals of Plato and Timaeus. To explain the nature and to account for the origin of general ideas is, even at this day, the greatest difficulty in abstract philosophy. How the human mind, when it reasons concerning the general nature of triangles, should either conceive, as Mr. Locke imagines it does, an essay concerning human understanding, the idea of a triangle, which is neither obtusangular, nor rectangular, nor acutangular, but which was at once both none and all of those together, or should, as Malebranche thinks necessary for this purpose, dans Recherche de la Vérité, comprehend at once, within its finite capacity, all possible triangles of all possible forms and dimensions, which are infinite in number, is a question to which it is surely not easy to give a satisfactory answer. Malebranche, to solve it, had recourse to the enthusiastic and unintelligible notion of the intimate union of the human mind with the divine, in whose infinite essence the immensity of such species could alone be comprehended, and in which alone, therefore, all finite intelligences could have an opportunity of viewing them. If, after more than 2,000 years' reasoning about this subject, this ingenious and sublime philosopher was forced to have recourse to so strange a fancy, in order to explain it, can we wonder that Plato, in the very first dawnings of science, should, for the same purpose, adopt an hypothesis which has been thought, without much reason, indeed, to have some affinity to that of Malebranche, and which is not more out of the way? What seems to have misled those early philosophers was the notion, which appears at first natural enough, that those things, out of which any object is composed, must exist antecedent to that object. But the things out of which all particular objects seem to be composed are the stuff or matter of those objects, and the former or specific essence which determines them to be of this or that class of things. These, therefore, it was thought, must have existed antecedent to the object which was made up between them. Plato, who held that the sensible world, which, according to him, is the world of individuals, was made in time, necessarily conceived that both the universal matter, the object of spurious reason, and the specific essence, the object of proper reason and philosophy out of which it was composed, must have had a separate existence from all eternity. This intellectual world, very different from the intellectual world of Worth, a reference to the title as well as the content of Worth's metaphysical treatise, mainly inspired by his interpretation of Plato, the true intellectual system of the universe. Though much of the language of the one has been borrowed from that of the other, was necessarily and always existent, whereas the sensible world owed its origin to the free will and bounty of its author. A notion of this kind, as long as it is expressed in very general language, as long as it is not much rested upon, nor attempted to be very particularly and distinctly explained, passes easily enough through the indolent imagination, accustomed to substitute words in the room of ideas, and if the words seem to hang easily together, requiring no great precision in the ideas, it vanishes, indeed, is discovered to be altogether incomprehensible, and eludes the grasp of the imagination upon an attentive consideration. It requires, however, an attentive consideration, and if it had been as fortunate as many other opinions of the same kind, and about the same subject, it might, without examination, have continued to be the current philosophy for a century or two. Aristotle, however, seems immediately to have discovered that it was impossible to conceive as actually existent either that general matter, which was not determined by any particular species, or those species which were not embodied, if one may say so, in some particular portion of matter. Aristotle, too, held, as we have already observed, the eternity of the sensible world, though he held, therefore, that all sensible objects were made up of two principles, both of which he calls equally substances, the matter and the specific essence. he was not obliged to hold, like Plato, that those principles existed prior in the order of time to the objects which they afterwards composed. They were prior, he said, in nature, but not in time, according to a distinction which was of use to him upon some other occasions. While this remark leaves a correct general impression, Aristotle nowhere seems to say explicitly that his principles, matter and specific essence, are prior in nature but not in time. He distinguished, too, betwixt actual and potential existence, matter and specific essence as substances. Actual and potential existence. See in general Sir David Ross, Aristotle's Metaphysics. By the first, he seems to have understood what is commonly meant by existence or reality; by the second, the bare possibility of existence. His meaning, I say, seems to amount to this, though he does not explain it precisely in this manner. Neither the material essence of body could, according to him, exist actually without being determined by some specific essence to some particular class of things, nor any specific essence without being embodied in some particular portion of matter. Each of these two principles, however, could exist potentially in this separate state. That matter existed potentially, which, being endowed with a particular form, could be brought into actual existence, and that form which, by being embodied in a particular portion of matter, could in the same manner be called forth into the class of complete realities. This potential existence of matter and form he sometimes talks of, in expressions which very much resemble those of Plato, to whose notion of separate essence it bears very great affinity. Aristotle, who seems in many things original, and who endeavored to seem to be so in all things, added the principle of privation to those of matter and form, which he had derived from the ancient Pythagorean school. When water is changed into air, the transmutation is brought about by the material principle of those two elements being deprived of the form of water, and then assuming the form of air. Privation, therefore, was a third principle opposite to form, which entered into the generation of every species, which was always from some other species. It was a principle of generation, but not of composition, as is obvious. The Stoics, whose opinions were, in all the different parts of philosophy, either the same with, or very nearly allied to those of Aristotle and Plato, though often disguised in very different language, held that all things, even the elements themselves, were compounded of two principles, upon one of which depended all the active, and upon the other all the passive powers of these bodies. Perhaps derived from Seneca. Oula, c'est du latin. J'abandonne. The last of these. Ah non. But whereas Smith is maintaining that this amounts to the same as the Platonic Aristotelian account, the drift of Seneca's epistle is that the Stoics by no means agreed with Plato and Aristotle, and were able to give a simpler account of the cause. The essence of things, he says, cannot properly be regarded as a cause. It is at best an ingredient in one. The last of these they called the matter, the first the cause, by which they... Merci. Je suis obligée, je passe la grègue et le capes. Et encore, en fait, je prends pas tant de temps que ça. The first the cause by which they meant the very same thing which Aristotle and Plato understood by their specific essences. Matter, according to the Stoics, could have no existence separate from the cause or efficient principle which determined it to some particular class of things. Neither could the efficient principle exist separately from the material, in which it was always necessarily embodied. Their opinion, therefore, so far coincided with that of the old Peripatetics. The efficient principle, they said, was the deity, by which they meant that it was a detached portion of the ethereal and divine nature which penetrated all things, that constituted what Plato would have called the specific essence of each individual object. And so far their opinion coincides pretty nearly with that of the latter Platonists, who held that the specific essences of all things were detached portions of their created deity, the soul of the world, and with that of some of the Arabian and scholastic commentators of Aristotle, who held that the substantial forms of all things descended from those divine essences which animated the celestial spheres. Such was the doctrine of the four principal sects of the ancient philosophers concerning the specific essences of things. The old Pythagoreans, of the academical, peripatetic, and stoical sects. Since Smith wrote in an age when physical, not yet chemical, atomism was a dominant mode of thought, it is surprising that the essay should break off without any reference to the Greek atomists, Leucippus and Democritus, mainly physical, and the later Epicurus, also strongly moral, as set forth in the poem De Rerum Natura by Lucretius. As this doctrine of specific essences seems naturally enough to have arisen from that ancient system of physics, which I have above described, and which is by no means devoid of probability, so many of the doctrines of that system, which seem to us, who have been long accustomed to another, the most incomprehensible, necessarily flow from this metaphysical notion. Such are those of generation, corruption, and alteration, of mixture, condensation, and rarefaction. A body was generated or corrupted when it changed its specific essence and passed from one denomination to another. It was altered when it changed only some of its qualities, but still retained the same specific essence and the same denomination. Thus, when a flower was withered, it was not corrupted. Though some of its qualities were changed, it still retained the specific essence, and therefore justly passed under the denomination of a flower. But when, in the further progress of its decay, it crumbled into earth, it was corrupted. It lost the specific essence or substantial form of the flower, and assumed that of the earth, and therefore justly changed its denomination. The specific essence or universal nature that was lodged in each particular class of bodies was not itself the object of any of our senses, but could be perceived only by the understanding. It was by the sensible qualities, however, that we judged on the specific essence of each object. Some of these sensible qualities, therefore, we regarded as essential, or such as showed, by their presence or absence, the presence or absence of that essential form from which they necessarily flowed. Others were accidental, or such whose presence or absence had no such necessary consequences. The first of these two sorts of qualities was called properties, the second accidents. In the specific essence of each object itself, they distinguished two parts, one of which was peculiar and characteristical of the class of things of which that particular object was an individual; the other was common to it with some other higher classes of things. These two parts were, to the specific essence, pretty much what the matter and the specific essence were to each individual body. The one which was called the genus was modified and determined by the other, which was called the specific difference, pretty much in the same manner as the universal matter contained in each body was modified and determined by the specific essence of that particular class of bodies. These four, with the specific essence or species itself, made up the number of the five universals, so well known in the schools by the names of genus, species, differentia, proprium, and accidents. End of History of Ancient Logics and Metaphysics of the External Senses, pour la suite.